But I'm delighted to be joined by Miriam Cates, Conservative MP for Penistone and Stocksbridge, who is a great expert on childcare. Miriam, what are your thoughts on what's been announced today?
Well, I'm very pleased that Jeremy Hunt has signalled that he wants to invest in the early years. I think that's very welcome. They're very important, those first 2 or 3 years of a child's life. But I think fundamentally this is the wrong answer to the wrong question. And you've mentioned rising childcare costs, and it's true, you know, costs to families in all sorts of ways have gone up. But one of the oft-repeated mantras, which the Chancellor himself said today, is that in Britain we have the highest childcare costs in comparable countries. And that's not actually true. Our childcare costs are not particularly higher than anywhere else. The problem is there are a higher proportion of families' net income. And the problem with that is that net income is low because our taxation is so high. And you alluded to this, in your comparison with Hungary, but in many, many other similar countries, families are not taxed or not taxed anywhere near as much as British families because the tax system recognise the importance of and the cost of raising children. So the issue we have in this country is not the cost of childcare, it's how little of income families get to keep. And I think also, although many people will welcome this policy, it doesn't provide choice. And again, you mentioned this in your opening statement. And many mothers do want to go back to work, but many mothers don't, and they want to look after their own children, particularly babies under 2. And I very much question, is this the right policy for children and families?
So it's very good for mothers who want to go back to work. It will provide them with more choice and more ability to go back to work, and the wraparound care will help with older children too. But what you're saying is that that's assuming that everybody wants to go back to work.
Yes, and I think there are certainly many women who do want to go back to work. And I think particularly if you've got a high-flying, high-paid, successful career, of course it's worth that trade-off, and perhaps you can afford to pay for a nanny or some, very high-quality childcare. But if you're stacking shelves in Tesco or filling in data, which are important jobs, and you make very little money once tax has gone and childcare's gone, is it worth that time that you don't spend with your children? But I also question whether it will actually work, because, as you know, there's an existing 30 hours entitlement for parents of 3- and 4-year-olds, but the uptake of that is only about 40%. And evidence suggests that free childcare doesn't really affect people's choice of how to use childcare.
Well, my constituents write to me saying that 30 hours free doesn't actually work because it doesn't pay enough, and therefore the childcare providers say, we'll only give you that if you pay for more hours, and so it's not really 30 hours for free. Have you been getting similar correspondence?
Yes, absolutely, and often nurseries have to charge parents for nappies or meals or things like that. But it's also very inflexible. It's office hours, or actually fewer than office hours, it's term time only. So again, if you've got an office job or a professional job, it might work. But if you do shift work, which a lot of women do, then it doesn't work and you can't use it because it's so inflexible. So as you said in the beginning, this is state help, but only under certain conditions, and it doesn't promote choice. Now, £4 billion is a lot of money. Why not give that £6,500 a year to families as credits or as a budget like they do in other countries, and then you can choose it. Pay granny to look after your child, work fewer hours, use formal childcare if you want to. That's a far more conservative way of looking at this problem.
Well, I suppose the Chancellor's answer to that would be that we need more people in the workforce because we've got 1 million vacancies, and having 1 million vacancies is being inflationary in terms of wages and feeding through, that actually the state has an interest in getting more people into work, and that's a valid interest for the state to have.
Well, yes, but our problem is actually a productivity one, isn't it? And I think what you see in countries which do send women back to work very early, and the Chancellor used the example of Denmark, is as female participation in the workplace rises, so does your gender pay gap, because as you send more women back to work, you create jobs in childcare and elderly care sectors that unfortunately don't pay very much, but mostly women do. So you create this gender pay gap. But I really question this assumption that women's primary value or mother's primary value is in the workplace contributing to GDP, because the job of a parent, particularly in those first 2 years of life, is a huge investment to their future success. And I know from the work that I've done with Andrea Leadsom, the early years, the first 1,001 days, the attachment with mum in those first 2 years is so important and has been scientifically proven for later life that I don't think this is the right policy for women or children. Of course, women should have the choice, and many women want to go back to work, and that's fine, but it should be a choice.
And what's going to happen between now and 2024 when the policy comes in? Because there's a bit of a delay. Do you think people assume it's immediate and they'll be disappointed when they don't get it tomorrow?
Well, they may well do, and obviously that is the way with headlines. And I think You know, even if I supported this policy, I would absolutely recognise that there needs to be some supply-side reform first. We know lots of nurseries are closing. We know there are recruitment problems in the sector. So, of course, there needs to be time. But, you know, I very much hope that that time is for a rethink, to give more choice to this policy, to pay families in child benefit, to reduce tax, to give more choice, rather than seeing this as the only option.
And to come back to the point I made earlier, the only people who can't be paid to look after children are members of the family. That seems to me to be slightly problematic, because it insists, therefore, that it's always done by strangers, whereas inevitably members of the family will have a greater affection, particularly for tiny children, where that's so important.
Absolutely. No one is more invested in the future of a child than their biological parents and their relatives. And I think, again, this just feeds into the narrative that you need professionals to look after your children and your child must have early years education. Of course, that's not true. All a young child needs is love and protection and care. You know, you don't need to know phonics and maths before you start school. Actually, you need a safe, secure environment. And again, you know, it just feeds into this narrative that the only value of parents is in the workplace, whereas actually the biggest contribution most of us can make to society is by being a good parent with enough time, energy and resource to invest in our children. It's a hard job, as you and I both know, and you can't do that if you're really struggling to spend time with your children.
Well, I think what you're saying is very compelling. I've always been very lucky. I mean, I've got 6 children, but I do have a bit of support to help with it, and my wife takes the major part of the burden on. But thank you so much for coming along again. You're becoming a regular visitor, and I hope that will continue. Thank you very much to Miriam.